Friends, please like this video. Subscribe to my channel, Dalsze Shastlivik. Write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Like, comment, subscribe, and let's get started.
We're all on our way.
In ISO, a fuel and lubricants warehouse in Moscow was attacked. There's a blackout in Smolensk.
Where is the blackout? Somewhere in Daria, somewhere in Suka. He went there and lived in Ukraine. What are you even doing here?
In Stovo, Nizhny Novgorod region, after a drone attack, a bitumen plant is on fire. The Lukoil refinery, Nizhny Novgorod, and Neftorg synthesis are also burning intensely. And this is the second attack on the refinery in less than a year.
So what? That's it!
All 3 launch installations from Kandar-M were destroyed as a result of a missile strike in the Bryansk region.
They hit it, look. They hit the base of the scum Conchina.
Yeah, really, what in the world is going on here?
Well, Muscovites are actually literally shooting down drones with their own hands. Or more precisely, with pistols.
So here's the situation. There are awards over there, apparently. There you go. Here we've got a train system, you see? This is how we set it up. We throw it in there. Oops, got tired. Just like that, me. And right here, these particular ones, they are like this. And over there, they fall basically in the forest.
So they make it all the way to the residential area.
What are you writing?
Moscow's on the line, yo.
And now the cherry on top. Ukrainian forces shot down a Russian multi-role 4th generation Su-35 fighter jet. The plane was hit in the Kursk direction. Boom, bada boom! The ground is covered in fiberglass. And our Neptunes are striking Sevastopol. Looks like they started celebrating Neptune's holiday early in Sevastopol.
That was indeed a launcher, Yepton, and that is certainly not a factory.
Drones are striking Moscow, and Peter, and Novorossiysk.
We spent the whole week in the basement. Every morning, every night, it's just constant wake-ups. They bring food down to the basement.
There he is, the red one. Oh, damn. Hands are covered in blood. Look, the element is burning.
Explosions, panic. Hundreds of thousands of people can't leave. For 4 days, they're flying toward Moscow, turning life in the Kremlin and Moscow into hell. But for them, friends, Ukraine is attacking St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the regions with drones around the clock. There it goes flying. And the cost of chaos in Russia is measured in billions of rubles, more than $230 million. An air disaster in Russia, which was the result of large-scale drone strikes on Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other regions.
It's flying. Lights, souls, damn it! Souls, lights!
Sorry, I couldn't record it. Here's a little circle. Hands covered in blood. 4 flights have been cancelled.
It's just insane. All cancellations. Everything's cancelled.
And the airports are paralyzed. Sheremetyevo, Pulkovo, Nizhny. People are crying, spending the night on the floor. Strikes on Aviation. The strategic base in Engels, the tactical one in Borisovglebsk, the fleet in Novorossiysk, and also the Pacific Fleet is under attack. The Kerch Bridge is being attacked by 15 missiles. An ammonia tanker in Ust-Luga has been blown up. But who is paying for all this? What does this mean personally for the Russian market? Let's find out now from my well-known economist and professor Igor Lipsitz. The damage from the carpet plan is estimated at more than 20 billion rubles. That's 236 million according to estimates. How do you assess the economic damage? What does this mean for Russia?
Look, Russia is a rather complicated country in terms of transportation. It's long. In geography, there is the concept of round countries, where generally it's not very far to get from the center to any point. There are countries that are long. Russia is long. For it, the transportation system is extremely important. The problem now is that Russia's civil aviation is in crisis. Passenger transportation is also not coping very well. This situation has already happened. After the last 24 hours in the airports, people rushed to the railway to at least get to St. Petersburg by train. Everything was instantly sold out. They're trying to urgently add extra carriages. You never know how this will end. Basically, the transportation connectivity is falling apart. And these losses for Russia's civil aviation are already quite an unpleasant issue. Russian civil aviation, to put it mildly, is not a very profitable sector. It's more often unprofitable. The point is that Russian aviation was structured in such a way that it made money from certain very international connections. First of all, Aeroflot had good income, and all foreign companies flying through Russian airspace paid for it. Transport routes to Asia passed through Russia, and vice versa. And Aeroflot received payment for the use of Russian airspace by planes in transit. Now, that's almost completely gone. If you look at an air traffic map somewhere like Flight Radar, you'll see that there are far fewer planes in Russian airspace, and naturally, that revenue has disappeared. Next, Russian companies used to earn a lot by transporting Russian tourists all over the world. But now Russian tourists have suddenly stopped traveling abroad. There's no need to mention that some people went to Dubai or others to Egypt. Those flows are nothing like what they used to be. Even the demand for foreign currency in Russia has sharply decreased, precisely because outbound tourism has practically died out. Accordingly, airlines can't transport passengers, and they used to have huge revenues. In the summer, there used to be a flood of charter flights, which is how these companies made their money. Now that's gone, and domestic transportation in Russia isn't very profitable. It's actually loss-making, and to this day, the Russian government subsidizes domestic travel so that Russians can move around the country, because if people can't travel within the country, then it's not really a country. In other words, there's no sense that it's a unified country if you simply can't get to certain places. But right now, that's exactly the situation that's taking shape. No amount of money can solve the security problem, which means that major Russian airports are starting to fail, resulting in huge losses for Russian airlines. I repeat, they're already in a difficult situation as it is, so what to do next is unclear. Of course, they will be asking the government for subsidies. And that would be fair, because it was the government that got them into this mess. It was the government that started the war, not the airlines. Now the airlines are suffering, but I'm afraid they won't get any money because right now there's no money for anything except the war. And we can already see this line of sufferers who go to the Ministry of Finance asking for money and they get turned down. Well, for example, there was already a case. Right now, Russia's coal industry is in a huge crisis. To support it, they introduced reduced tariffs for coal transportation. But then the losses fell on Russian Railways, RZD. Russian Railways, RZD, came to the government of Grikov. They said, give us subsidies to cover the losses we're incurring so that Russia's coal industry doesn't die quickly. They were told, you weren't invited here and no subsidies were given, and so on. So in this sense, a closed loop in the economy of air transportation will generally be difficult. That's why I think we will see some very unpleasant stories related to the bankruptcy of Russian airlines and consolidation. And soon, there may be only one airline left in Russia, Aeroflot. The other airlines apparently will not survive. Well, that's how I see the situation.
Igor Vladimirovich, what about the lack of connectivity, the non-working internet, YouTube? We've noticed that after the special operation, even Russian insiders report that across all of Russia, not just in major cities, communication and internet are being jammed. This is how they are trying to fight against special operations and Ukrainian intelligence services. How does this affect the lives of ordinary Russians?
This means that Russians are being completely cut off. It may seem like a strange topic to global civilization, but right now I have acquaintances who have come to Russia for a while to visit their parents. And they say with horror that they've ended up in some kind of, black zone. Nothing works, nothing is possible. We can't connect to the outside world at all. They say we try VPNs one after another. Not a single VPN works. After the first connection, the second one is immediately blocked. The VPN gets detected and then it stops working. So you end up in a soundproof room, so to speak. You just can't connect with the outside world in any way. You can't communicate with anyone. You can't work remotely. You're trapped inside Russia's information space. And overall, it's honestly a terrifying situation. It has a significant impact. You know, I've noticed this quite clearly. My YouTube views have dropped because many Russians simply can't watch. Now I've switched, to recording all my streams, and I also make audio files. I created a special audio channel on Telegram so that people can at least listen to my interviews, including yours, which will be available in audio format. People can still somehow listen to audio directly from Telegram, but they can't watch anymore. So people are being cut off from gaming sites. As you can see, people are being cut off from WhatsApp, from Telegram. People are gradually being cut off from YouTube as well. And basically, it's becoming a closed system. I would say that an informational concentration camp is being formed. Russians used to shout that the war doesn't affect them in any way. It's somewhere out there on the outskirts. It's a special military operation. It has nothing to do with us at all. But now the war has reached them quite directly through flight cancellations and the disappearance of the ability to live in the information space. As they say, you reap what you sow.
Dear audience, as I was just saying to Dmitry Vladimirovich, we're interested in where you're watching us from. Write in the comments your city, country, and how you're watching. Let us know if you're using a VPN or not. Share details supporting Ukraine and tell us about your connectivity. We work for a global audience, so people know the truth about Russian aggression and its war against Ukraine. That's why every comment and every subscription means that you are on the side of light. As for an important topic, the attacks on airfields from an economic and military perspective, how much does it actually cost to restore infrastructure after the strikes in Engels, Borisogledsk, and after the attacks on key strategic military airfields like Patina? And how do such strikes on strategic aviation affect the military budget and Russia's ability to keep fighting for years to come?
Well, look, the situation is interesting. There was a report that Russia is trying to expand a plant for the production of airfields. But because up to now, Russian aviation has, in general, lost this capability. How should I put it? Once upon a time, Russia was a very great, powerful, and renowned aviation power. There were quite good designers, and there were good combat aircraft. And we remember this situation. I still remember from my childhood all those stories about intense dogfights in the skies over Korea and Vietnam, where Soviet pilots disguised as Vietnamese fought against American pilots. Back then, it was quite an even war, a truly significant one. And back then, it seemed that Russian aviation would always be a very powerful industry. But then the collapse continued somewhere in the 1990s. And in general, the Russian aviation industry never really recovered from that blow. And now it has found itself in a kind of trouble because, as they say, they're just barely keeping things flying, squeezing every last bit of life out of old aircraft. It's difficult to build new planes now, including both civilian and military aircraft. It's hard to put new machines into service because there just aren't the resources. How can I put it? So much has been lost. This isn't a very fast or obvious process to people. It's a process of degradation. When you talk about it, people are surprised. What do you mean, degradation? But people are still making things, you see. And when the older generation starts to leave, it's important that a new generation of designers, engineers, technologists, and skilled workers comes in to take over the production capabilities. Then the industry survives. But in Russia, that's a complete disaster because basically there are no personnel, neither design engineers nor skilled workers. And this isn't something I'm making up. Look, Chemezov, the head of Rostec, stated this quite clearly not long ago. He said that basically there's a huge shortage of personnel for the military industry in Russia. And what will come of this, we don't know. So far, all this talk about how we'll reproduce and start making strategic bombers again and so on, it's a very complicated story because for that, the industry has to be capable of doing it. But that sense just isn't there because we see a simple picture. For example, nothing is working out in civil aviation. Russia can't launch new airplanes. It desperately needs new modern airplanes. There are projects like the MC-21. They're trying to make a new plane, some regional aircraft like the Baikal, but nothing is working out. So much has been destroyed, so much has been lost that it's extremely difficult to restore. And even the combat aircraft that Russia had, like the Su series, are already starting to fall behind simply because their electronics are outdated and they don't have their own modern electronics. That's why, of course, these losses are practically irrecoverable because Russia's current industrial capabilities simply don't allow for such easy restoration. They can produce the simplest types of weapons like ammunition, and they've learned to make some basic drones. But when it comes to something very complex, it seems it's no longer really possible to restore that. At this point, even money won't help. Mighty, it's not about lacking the money to restore the fleet of strategic bombers. You can provide the money, but actually making it happen is no longer possible.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding the tanker fleet, we understand that there have been strikes on Novorossiysk bases in the Far East, and there was also an incident with a tanker in St. Petersburg. What is the overall economic scale of the losses at the Novorossiysk fleet bases in the Far East? Is this an apocalypse for raw material exports and logistics chains?
Overall, the situation with maritime exports is becoming very complicated. I can't say it's a catastrophe yet, but the situation is getting worse. A few problems have emerged, so to speak. The first problem is that European countries have finally decided to start inspecting Russian ships. In fact, talk about this, as you know, started somewhere around February or March of last year. At that time, I also wrote about this, that in general, there was a certain directive from the European Union. Maybe directive is too strong a word, but a recommendation from the EU to Denmark to implement strict control over the passage of tankers carrying Russian oil through the Danish Strait. Basically, the Danes were quite perplexed and taken aback at the time and showed no readiness whatsoever. They said it would be very difficult for them to do this. In reality, though, making it harder for these ships to pass is entirely possible if there were the will to do so. So as you can see, this scenario is now starting to play out. NATO ships are planning to inspect these vessels, specifically those transporting Russian oil, to check whether they meet the requirements for this type of navigation in the Baltic, insurance, and so on. So if the insurance requirements are not met, the ships will be automatically blacklisted, meaning even without any special decisions from NATO, the EU, the US, and so on, they will fall under sanctions and face major problems. Therefore, there is a threat that a very large portion of the shadow fleet that Russia has created will simply turn out to be unviable. We've already heard the figure. Check it. Of course, it's all quite difficult because you see, we're talking about things that aren't very obvious, rather secretive, and only some indirect estimates appear, which is what I rely on. That up to 400 ships are already on this blacklist and they're already being refused service. Accordingly, these vessels are basically docked, laid up, anchored, moored, use whatever term you like, but they're not sailing, right? So if this list is expanded now, Russia will face major problems. And still, if they manage to push through the idea of lowering the price cap to 45, which is part of the 18th package, then there will be even more difficulties and Russian maritime exports will decline even further. The combination with low oil prices is a very serious blow to Russia's financial situation, to the Russian budget, and to spending on Russian life. This is, of course, a path that leads to an extremely serious crisis situation in Russia's economy.
Igor Vladimirovich, you also brought up another important topic, the shadow fleet and the 18th sanctions package from the US position. So far, there is no talk of $30 per barrel. But regarding the shadow fleet, which Europe is not yet fighting, just recently, German Chancellor Scholz said Germany will strengthen control over the shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea. As you
know, only Slovakia and Hungary are currently blocking it. But in this regard, the European Union is starting to learn something and is working out ways to bypass these blockades from Hungary and Slovakia because they are always against it. They are practically a fifth column within the European Union. I don't understand how the European Union can continue to put up with this, but that's their problem. Therefore, of course, there may be some decisions that will allow them to actually implement this cap after all. And that would already be significant because, as they say, America is far away, but the ships, are sailing around Europe, right? They leave from Osloja and they sail around Europe. And accordingly, if not a single European port services them, they will have quite significant problems. And the US doesn't even benefit there. So you mentioned the word benefit, but no. The US doesn't gain anything from Russia exporting oil, right? But there are some idiotic concepts from Trump, like not quarreling with Putin, thinking that at some point he'll come to his senses and eventually agree to end the war. That's a rather strange concept. But Trump had these dreams of quickly resolving this conflict and getting a Nobel Prize for it, which is why he can't bring himself to finally break it off. He's even starting to grumble that Putin isn't living up to his expectations, but nevertheless, he still doesn't want to impose sanctions against Russia, hoping that Putin will eventually come to his senses and, for his own benefit, back down. Of course, that's an illusion. It's not going to happen. But unfortunately, What you're saying also means something else quite simple. By the way, this was voiced by the leadership of the European Union. They said that we need to understand that the West, as we used to know it, no longer exists. In other words, this unified bloc of countries that was ready to somehow contain Russia's aggression no longer exists. There is the European Union as a separate entity, then there is Europe as a whole, meaning a collection of states both inside and outside the EU, and then there is the United States as a separate territory. This is the reality we are living in with you.
Igor Vladimirovich, but if the EU votes for the 18th package of sanctions, how likely is it to be implemented, considering the shadow fleet and US positions? You correctly noted America's economic stance is unclear. I talk to economists. They say, Lubick, Trump, it's unclear, purely a political decision.
Of course, look, we have to understand that the price cap is still at 60 Russian oil. Well, for now, I keep mentioning very indirect figures, but we live in a country that has classified all statistics, so it's very difficult. But still, apparently, right now, Russian exports are going at a price of about 52 to 53, which is below the cap. And that means Greek ships are transporting it, yes. Greek ship owners are making money. They are always carefully trying to help out and earn for themselves. They have repeatedly made money off Russia. At first, they were transporting oil in 2022 extremely actively, and before the price cap was introduced, they made huge profit. Then they sold their old tankers to Russia, and as I understand it, this entire so-called shadow fleet consists of former Greek tankers, but only those that were due to be decommissioned. You see, the Russian shadow fleet is made up of old rust buckets, as they're called, because oil tankers are supposed to be exported for only 12 to 15 years. After that, they start to become quite dangerous. They rust and all sorts of other problems begin to happen with them. Usually they're sent to be scrapped, but the Greeks managed to sell their old junk to Russia for quite large sums, billions. And now these shadow vessels, the Russian shadow fleet, are tankers that are 25 to 30 years old. They are dangerous, they are environmentally hazardous, which is why Europe is starting to get nervous. Even though Europe is rather slow and indecisive, everyone understands that if there are any major spills, the entire surrounding region in Europe will suffer greatly. So there is at least some movement happening. Let's see what comes of this, because Russia has also started deploying warships to escort these tankers. This is, of course, a very interesting situation because the ships themselves are not sailing under Russian flags. It's one thing if I'm escorting a ship that's sailing under the Russian flag, but if it's, say, a Liberian ship and for some reason I'm protecting it, then an interesting question arises. Why are you protecting a Liberian ship? What kind of joy are you getting out of this? So, of course, there could be some very unpleasant naval conflicts here. We'll see how it all ends. But the very fact that the ships have started going out and inspecting these oil tankers is, of course, an interesting development and overall proper management. So if the price cap is set at 45, the Greeks will stop transporting. They're afraid of this because, after all, nobody wants to end up under sanctions. A vessel that falls under sanctions can hardly operate anymore. Even if it carries other cargo, once it's sanctioned, it's basically lost. But no one wants to lose their assets. So if the price is set at 45 now, the Greeks will again stop transporting Russian oil. And this will be a very big blow to Russian oil exports and consequently to budget revenues.
And by the way, regarding American sanctions, the American sanctions have gone up by 500% and seem like an unrealistic scenario. But what about the bureaucrats, the linchpin? Do you think they could lower this, make it 20%, 50%, 100% for secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian gas, oil, and petroleum products in bulk like China and India and simply stop doing it? What do you think?
Well, first of all, let's see in what form the bill will be passed. Because bills change, and right now they've passed a big, beautiful bill, and some things have already been dropped from it, right? There were a few really wild things in there that got dropped during the approval process because not everything was so crazy. And in the end, they were thrown out because, well, European countries made it clear to the US that if this was passed, the response would be so strong, it would be hard to handle. In this sense, the US would face very serious retaliatory sanctions, and it would be better if these measures were not adopted. For example, I think one of the sections, Section 899, was simply removed. So let's take a look at the form in which the big, beautiful bill was adopted. And now let's see, for example, how this bill will actually be passed. I'll put it this way. I paid attention to Graham's words after he played golf. Just think about how absurd life has become. We're discussing politicians' statements after playing golf with the President of the United States. This is a kind of vulgarized political system, but we are forced to live in this vulgar political world, and it's absolutely disgusting. So he said that he and the president had a talk. At least he didn't use the word hashed it out. That's basically how their mechanics work. Lock lexic, by the way, Trump has about the same, kind of like a street thug style. So we talked to the president here, and our task is to speed up the adoption of the bill to arm the president with this bill. So if we translate this into concrete terms, it means that this bill started out as a direct action bill, introducing a 500% tariff for countries buying Russian energy resources. But most likely, it will be adopted as a secondary action law, granting the US president the authority to impose such tariffs. And whether he actually imposes them or not, just look at Trump, how he sometimes imposes things and sometimes doesn't. So I would say that Lindsey Graham's bill was quite ambitious, but in reality, it might end up being a completely meaningless piece of paper.
Igor Dmitrievich, regarding inflation, poverty, and the general risk of social unrest, we keep seeing conflicts around us involving minorities. This could even be connected to the construction sector. I spoke with an economist who said that the worse the Russian economy performs, the more representatives of ethnic minorities will form their own power blocks, and there will be certain military or paramilitary conflicts. He put it quite diplomatically. As for poverty inflation, is there a risk of a new wave of poverty and social unrest within Russia? I'm interested in your opinion.
The risk of an abyss is high. I have an article that's supposed to come out in the next few days. Maybe it was even published today. I haven't checked yet. In Republic, where I discuss this. Putin, at the St. Petersburg Forum, declared that Russia is entering an era of high-wage economics. Incredibly beautiful words. Absolutely false, absolutely meaningless, but beautifully said. He's truly a master of political demagoguery. In reality, Russia is entering a period of declining living standards because wage growth in Russia has stopped while the cost of living continues to rise. This year, there's a serious one. Well, maybe not the very first, but the first truly significant one, and apparently there will be more to come. But the first truly significant one is the increase in utility tariffs. Right now, I'm receiving letters from people all over the country about the increases they've experienced. I think the record was in the Omsk region, 40%. Today, I got another message about a 29% increase in tariffs somewhere. This is, of course, a very serious blow because, well, not everyone has seen their salaries grow at all in recent years. Many public sector workers receive such weak compensation for inflation that they've been getting poorer for a long time and no longer understand how they're going to survive. That's why, of course, Russia is now entering a period of impoverishment, and many who used to be middle class are becoming poor. They write letters to me too, saying that they used to feel like they were solid middle class. At the very least, they could afford everything, the goods needed for a normal family life. Once a year, we would go abroad on vacation and everything was great. But now we can't even go into regular stores, supermarkets anymore. And now we go to the cheapest, most bare-bones supermarkets, like Svetofor or Pobeda, where the prices are rock bottom, but the quality of the products is completely questionable. You never know if you'll survive or not. So that's the picture. Suddenly we've become poor. We've stopped being middle class, we've become poor. And this is a situation that's only going to get worse, because most likely there will be even more budget cuts and people will start to suffer from it. Maybe a trend that's already taken shape will become even more pronounced. That's delays in wage payments. A very unpleasant topic for Russians. But that happy story for the country, so to speak, is over, and now the unhappy one has begun. And Herman Gref has already spoken about this. He said that they are receiving quite a lot of requests from individuals who took out loans from Sberbank asking for a deferral on their loan repayment. And in a quarter of the cases, it's because people simply aren't being paid their wages. We would pay off the loan, but we haven't received our salaries, so there's nothing to pay with. So you see, this trend has already taken shape at the level of Sberbank. Non-payments are on the rise. Now they've raised utility rates, and among 5 million Russians, there's already 1 trillion rubles in unpaid utility bills. And now it's quite difficult to pay this off because, generally speaking, people just don't have those kinds of earnings anymore. And as you know, the penalties keep accumulating. That's why the penalties are calculated based on the central bank's interest rate. There are a lot of different approaches to this. So in this sense, people are drowning in debt and will have their electricity cut off. And their gas will be cut off too. And Russian cities will start turning into, how should I put it, into rather uncivilized places to live. This will lead to people trying to find ways to cope. A year and a half ago, when I said people should start thinking about getting wood stoves for their homes, everyone laughed at me. They said, "What is this professor talking about? Wood stoves in apartment buildings. How are you supposed to haul firewood up to the top floor?" But now, of course, this is becoming very relevant. For now, people have started bringing gas cylinders into their apartments, which is why explosions have started happening in apartments. Because people don't really know how to handle this gas properly. They set up gas stoves, they brought in gas cylinders, and apparently, since the gas was shut off, they're trying to save money, trying to survive somehow. But all of this ends in explosions. Recently, there were 3 explosions in just one day. Household gas exploded, the cylinders blew up. How did a gas cylinder end up in an apartment building? The building is already connected to the gas supply. So where did the cylinder come from? It means they're replacing it. This is the kind of thing that's going to keep happening, and Russian cities will, how should I put it, turn into ghettos for the poor. But will this? These events probably do create some social discontent, but it will be very localized. There will be some outrage directed at the mayor, at most at the governors, maybe some serious social unrest, but it won't escalate, well, unless it gradually leads to road blockades. That's when other kinds of events will start to happen. So keep an eye on when people in Russia start blocking railways and federal highways. That's when it will become clear that Russia is slowly starting to boil over. For now, we don't see that happening.
Igor Vladimirovich, the final topic I wanted to discuss with you today. We see that partly due to Trump's policies, Putin has started to use drone and missile terror. Our military command says that in the future it could be 1,000 drones per day, and this will happen regularly, several times a week, maybe even more. In general, Putin is ramping up production, and here I'd like to ask you from an economic and military perspective, how much longer can the military machine continue this terror against Ukraine and even scale it up?
So scaling up is probably not very likely, but continuing is possible because, of course, notice that Putin said Russia is already excessively burdened by military spending and that military expenses need to be reduced. He said this in Minsk, but I don't think they will cut all military spending to the maximum. They will reduce spending on the production of those types of weapons that are not very effective. For example, it's unlikely that new Russian tanks will be produced, as you can imagine. Russian tanks have not proven themselves to be very effective weapons. No one has seen any Armata tanks on the battlefield, as you can see, even though there were claims that this was a terrifying tank that would guarantee victory for the Russian army and that everything would be accomplished instantly, but none of that happened. But they are producing drones, they are ramping up production of this kind of simple equipment, they are sourcing some electronics through China, and this will continue. As long as Russia doesn't collapse, Russia will keep producing a lot of weapons, and you'll have to fight against that. In this sense, even very poor regions are capable of producing weapons. Look at Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians have destroyed their own economy, their population lives in poverty, but they still manage to produce all sorts of nasty, vile military means and periodically try to launch them. What does Israel do? It creates the Iron Dome, it develops lasers for interception. I think Ukraine has only one option: to keep developing increasingly powerful air defense systems and destroy as many of the launched weapons as possible. I wouldn't count on Russia suddenly weakening and stopping production of these weapons anytime soon.
Dear audience, please like this video, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments, and subscribe to Igor Lips's YouTube channel. It's very important. The link will be in the description. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dasha Shastlivaya. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Crimea. Today we discussed the war economy and the capabilities of the Russian military machine to wage war. Next, with the well-known economist and professor. See you next time. Thank you.
All the best. Goodbye.